Well, welcome everyone. I wish I could see how many of you were here last week and how many of you participated in the elevator pitch session last week. Last week was all about content. This week we're going to build on that, and we're going to start talking about those pitch decks, those visuals that we need to create. So last week we were talking about this thing of, the old world, new world, right? It used to be that these conversations were happening in person, and now they're happening over Zoom, and that includes those investor conversations. And so how does that change how we approach things? Well, in a lot of ways, there's similarities, right? The elevator pitch and what you say is pretty similar. And the advantage of the new world is that you have this opportunity to kind of craft and hone it and perfect it. What you send is your flat deck or your pitch deck. It's what people ask for. Hey, send me your slides. And in the same way that you have this opportunity to really perfect your elevator pitch, I think there's this advantage in this world of using your visuals just a little bit more powerfully. Because if you think about Zoom, right, which we're using now and is probably the view that you have, you've got your slides that take up the majority of the real estate, and then you've got this little itty bitty box that's your face. And so the things that maybe mattered a little bit more in person, body language, facial expression, are a little bit harder to convey over Zoom. But on the opposite side of that, you now have this whole screen to work with. So if you really are paying attention to how you're using your visuals and using them well, they can really play to your advantage in this new world. So let's take a look at them specifically. Now, here's the spectrum that shows, the spectrum between what's a presentation and what's a document, right? Where does the pitch deck fall, right? It's not really a presentation, to be honest, because it's used for sending as a leave behind. It's used on Zoom, which kind of has its own presentation do's and don'ts, but it's definitely not a document. It's not like an executive summary that you would print out and sit down and read. Well, I think the pitch deck falls kind of in between, a little bit more toward the presentation side of the spectrum, but definitely in this weird middle ground. And I think that's why it's difficult sometimes to kind of come and approach building it with the right mindset, because you're not exactly sure what you're building. You're like, am I building a presentation? Am I building a document? If I'm building a presentation, I'm going to use, big, expansive visuals and very few words. If I'm building a document, I'm a lot more concerned about the words and the content. So with a pitch deck, it looks a little bit more like something like this icon, right? It's got words and pictures. It's typically used as a send ahead or a leave behind. But this is the important part, the goal, right? What is your goal with it? Your goal is to facilitate a conversation, because your first pitch is usually a conversation. Your first pitch often isn't, a stand and deliver kind of moment. It's not this super formal Zoom where you have, a bunch of people joining in. It's a conversation. And yes, it's a conversation over Zoom, but it's still a conversation, right? So I want you to keep that in mind as we're looking at some things today and looking at some examples, because I will be sharing a lot of examples. Nancy Duarte, who is the founder of Duarte, where I worked, she wrote years ago, wrote a, I don't even know what to call it. She wrote a book, but she wrote it in presentation software, and it's called Slide Docs. And here's what she said. She said, slide docs are visual documents developed in presentation software that are intended to be read and referenced instead of projected. And I mean, she hits the nail on the head with this term, right? It's not a slide, it's not a document, it's a slide doc. And, it's not something that's necessarily how we would think about a traditional presentation. So I would say that if you look into slide docs a little bit more, they're probably almost too dense for a pitch deck, but there's a lot we can learn from them and a lot that we can draw from them and draw from the research that she's done and how these are used in the business culture. Okay, so when you think about a document versus a slide, let's think about some of the advantages and disadvantages and why we tend to use these in the startup culture. Well, a slide is very scannable. A document is thorough. Slides are used for more high-level overviews. Documents are getting in-depth. Slides are modular, right? You can put them in slide sorter view and jump from slide to slide. You can kind of look at the whole thing and get a sense of the whole scape of everything, see the whole from the parts. Documents are linear. You scroll through the pages, right? Slides are versatile, right? This is a great advantage. They hold a variety of content and media. They can hold charts. You can drop a video in there. They can hold text. Documents are a little bit more rigid. Yes, you can drop things in there, but they're more suited for words. And a big advantage, right, is that slides, they're actually editable by anyone. Now, a lot of us don't edit slides well, but we don't have to go and get a degree in graphic design to be able to use them, which you might have to do with InDesign or something you would use to lay out, executive summary or a business plan. So this is why we use them. And even those of us that don't use them well, it doesn't mean they're not a good medium. They actually are a really, really great medium with a lot of advantages. And it also really speaks to some of the needs that a VC has, right? So a VC, if you're sending if your use case is a send ahead, that VC probably is going to look at it in 10 minutes before they meet with you. So if you've given them a thorough document, the chances are they're going to go, I don't got time for this. And they don't even look at it. If you send them a pitch deck, right? If they send them some slides, they are going to have time to scan that, and they may not get everything out of that thing, but that's what the conversation is for, and it still preps them to feel a little more prepared going into the conversation. So slides really speak to a lot of the needs that we have for this unique communication context that we use the pitch deck for. Okay, so how do you approach creating your pitch deck? Well, in my work with startups, this is something I do all the time, and this is really the process that I follow. I start by identifying the key messages. What are the questions, right? Last week we talked about the 5 questions. That's what I start with. Then I brainstorm content and visuals, right? Just get all my ideas out there. What could be a chart that I'd have here? What would be a statement? Then I start prioritizing and eliminating, right? So I start thinking, I think this is the most powerful idea that proves this point. So I like that the most. Here's some that I don't, yes, they speak to the problem solved, but I don't feel like they do a great job. So I start eliminating that. And then finally, I get to the point where I start creating the slides. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's how it looks. So identifying key messages. For those of you who weren't here last week, this is where we start. And what I talked about last week was that there's 5 questions an investor wants answered in that pitch, right? Those are what you're seeing below. What is your idea? How does it solve a key customer pain point? How big is the opportunity? What's your unfair advantage? And how will your idea change the world? So this is where I start. And then my key messages are the things in these 5 boxes: my single sentence description, my problem solved. So when I'm brainstorming, I'll brainstorm a bunch of different options for problem solved, but then I'll filter up to the one that I like the most. And I do the same with every other category. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is just a picture of my wall from a couple months ago when I was working on a presentation that I was going to give over Zoom. And you can see it's a combination of visuals and pictures. But I am by no means an artist, but I can visually think, right? I can take my pen out and I can do this. And I love this statement from Dan Roam, who wrote the book, The Back of the Napkin. Great book on visual thinking. But at this stage, pick up a pen, draw pictures, write short phrases, and do this even if you have like a working pitch deck, right? You might have one that you're kind of rethinking. It's easy when you do that to go, I'm just going to stay in PowerPoint. I'm just going to stay in Google Slides. No, stand up, get out. Even if you're going to use some of those slides again, draw pictures of them. There's something really powerful about picking up the pen. So do it. So best practices for creating slides, and we're going to see a lot of examples of these, but when I think about, if I could say, 4 things, right, as you're approaching your pitch deck. Number 1, write your titles as headlines. What this means is that it facilitates the takeaway, right, that you're wanting people to be able to scan and get the idea. It's the difference between writing something like problem and actually explaining that problem in a very few words in a title. That's what I mean, and we'll look at some examples. Turning bullet points into diagrams. The last thing any of us want to see when we open a pitch deck is a whole bunch of bullet points. It just, again, it's almost like a document moment. We're going, I don't want to read this, right? 1 idea per slide. Now you can have things that support that, but stick with 1 core idea per slide. And finally, content is king. And what I mean by this is that you may have a visual that you love or aesthetically you think looks really good, but if it doesn't really drive home the message, the content, the idea for that slide, get rid of it. That needs to be your guide. Okay, so let's see some real slides. I have case studies for you. These are entrepreneurs that I have worked with, and I'm going to be sharing some before and afters. They were super gracious to allow me to do this on a webinar, but they did ask that it didn't get sent around or anything like that. So please honor that in taking screenshots and things like that. But what I really tried to do was pick a range of kind of context and setting for who they were pitching, so you could see kind of this there's almost like a mini spectrum within the pitch deck world, right? So we're going to see some examples of that. The other thing I want to say is that for these examples, because a lot of the startups I work with are still actively pitching VCs, they couldn't share. So a lot of these are not venture pitches, but they, like this one, for example, you'll see his primary audience was private equity. But even though he wasn't pitching VCs, he was pitching private equity, there's still a lot we can learn, and there's a lot of crossover and similarities. So let's jump into it. This is Thomas Kim. His company is called Everclean, formerly Everwash, which you'll see when we get into the slides. And his use case, it was primarily for in-person conversations, pre-COVID. Secondary use case was from the stage. He was going to have a couple opportunities to speak at some accelerators and some events. And then finally, as a leave behind after the conversation. Now, Thomas's business is car washes. He had this idea to buy and build car washes and brand them and do this subscription model. And he was now, actually the Ducky's car wash down the street started doing subscription model recently. But at the time that I was working with him, this was like a brand new thing in the car wash world. So here is just a quick grab of what some of his slides looked like before. So a couple things you can see right off the bat. Definitely not scannable, right? Too much content, big blocks. A lot of colors, right? There's a lot of inconsistency in the colors. Not a lot of structure to the slides. And cheesy stock photography. Gotta love the thumbs up guy there. So let's look at the after. So this is just slide sorter mode, light table mode on Keynote, and what the slides look like when we were done working on them. Let's look at some specifically. So one of the big things that he had to talk about that was really impressive was kind of testing his model. He had a case study. And so what he'd done is he'd bought this car wash that was not profitable and was not doing well. And he basically, you know, did kind of tested his thesis of like, let's brand it, let's do the subscription model, let's offer people memberships, and let's just see if we can turn this business around. So this was a huge core part of his why us, right? The answer to like, why us? Why should you invest in this company? Because we've proven that the model works. Here's how the case study looked like before. He had these pictures, but you really couldn't see them. He had a lot of data, and he had, you know, a little bit of a sense of like, you know, what happened, right? I purchased it here, reopened it here, stabilized it. Here's what we did. We turned it into 2 slides. And the big reason I wanted to do this was for the before and after moment that you're seeing here, right? So this was their alpha site, right? Before and after. You can see now very clearly the difference. You can kind of get a feel for that branding, which was a big part of their value proposition. And took over a failed location to test our thesis. So if you remember before, they didn't really have a headline, right? We added just a simple headline so that this could stand on its own if somebody was scanning it as a leave behind. And then we moved the data onto another slide because we wanted to give it more room for people to, again, glance, scan, and be able to see what they needed to see. And then kept our headline, you know, stabilized and profitable within 4 months. The other thing that you're seeing here that I want to point out is colors, right? So he went from a lot of different colors to basically 3 colors. And I think that's a really important rule of thumb. You know, less is more when you're talking about colors and presentations. And you can usually work within the range of like 1 color and kind of its variations, its gradients, to be able to get the variety that you need. Okay, here was how he was talking about his problem in his first slide. And this is a perfect example of too many messages, right? Every one of these bubbles is a different message of how much revenue and how much profit and all these things are in the car wash industry. And then you've got these quotes on the side. This is basically trying to do way, way, way too much. And so the way we came at his problem when we redid it was we actually did a relatable experience. And this was what he used from the stage. So he would start by saying, hey, where'd you go for your last car wash? And we just found a picture of a very standard looking car wash to start with so that people could really relate. And then he would talk about everything that was wrong with it. Now, because this needed to be a leave behind, we did some adaptations and some additional slides we would include when it was a leave behind. So here's how we built on the problem for the leave behind. A lot of what you're seeing here was something that from the stage he would just speak to, right? He'd talk about how it's fragment, outdated, inconvenient, and unprofessional. But for the leave behind, for something that they would need to be sent on their own, this is how we approach that. You can see it's very pithy statements. It's got some supporting text. Really clear content hierarchy here though, right? I know exactly where my eyes go is from the title all the way to the blue text. Car wash industry is ready for a reboot. It's fragment, outdated, inconvenient, and unprofessional. There's still a lot of content on here. I would never present this from a stage. It's too much, right? If you were speaking from a stage. But for a pitch deck, when it's the leave behind, I think it makes a lot of sense. This was a backup to give more detail on the problem. So we put this in the appendix. And this was getting into some of the detail around the fragmentation of the industry and the fact that 93% of the industry is basically up for grabs. Like you've got a couple of these branded experiences, Mr. Car Wash, Auto Bell, Mike's Express, but there's a huge chunk of this industry that's just ready to be taken by someone offering a branded experience. We put this in the appendix because we felt like it could all be spoken to really well. But if some people were digging deeper and wanted more, he could pull this out in Q&A. We still used a headline here, as you can see, right? We still talked about it's a big industry with no dominant player. That's the key message here. So problem solved, right? Those were all problem. How did he solve them? Well, this was a slide that we developed to really speak to his value proposition. What are they doing? They're building and buying car washes under a visible, modern brand. It's about the brand, it's about the convenience, it's about the service, and about the technology. So again, this would be something where if I was presenting from the stage or presenting in a more formal environment, I'd probably remove some of the white text that you're seeing under the words and just speak to it. But for a leave behind, this is something someone can scan and get what they need from it right away. His promised land. So that's something you can't see here in just this screenshot, but that we did when he was presenting from the stage was that little lockup on the right that says mostly clean and sometimes dirty. So his brand promise to his customers, because of the subscription model, was feel good about your car always, right? And you go from a mostly dirty car that's sometimes clean to mostly clean and sometimes dirty. And so in the presentation that he gave from the stage, we used animation and had that kind of flip those words in kind of a fun way. Okay, let's look at another example. This is a company called Yenko, founders Margo, Wright. And Margo's primary audience for this, Yenko is essentially, they're developing apps and technology to help students not lose their financial aid. So last week I had Scholly as a little bit of an example. They help students find scholarships. Well, Margo's kind of on the back end of that. Once students get scholarships or get loans, there's oftentimes benchmarks they have to keep, GPAs, taking a certain amount of credits to keep that financial aid. A lot of students don't know that, and they end up losing their financial aid, which then they stop going to college when they don't have that. So her primary audience was philanthropic donors, fellowships, and foundations, coming from more of kind of a social entrepreneurial side. And the primary use case was in-person conversations and the leave behind. So let's take a look at a couple slides. So first of all, here's the before. And again, you're seeing just pretty dense content. She's got some more consistency to her colors, but there's some work to be done. You can also see that a lot of her slides, they're written just with the solution, the opportunity, the problem, but they don't actually tell you problem solution in the headline. So here it is after. And you can see the content is still pretty dense on these slides. However, there's a lot more structure and organization to it. So again, thinking about that leave behind context. We also, took those headlines and we took those titles and wrote a lot of them as headlines so that if someone's scanning this, again, I can read really quickly, slide 6, access to information builds agency, and I get the key message of that slide. The other thing that we did is we went and got some stock photography, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that first slide, that photo was that was a Getty Images like $500 purchase, and it hurt, right? She was so early stage. I don't want to spend money on this, but everything else we got in here was actually from a free stock photography site, and so we bought the rights to that. Because we needed that kind of moment. That's kind of her promised land, right? It's making graduation possible by expanding financial aid opportunities. And so we felt like it was worth it. And so that's where we kind of spent the money, and then we went pretty lean on everything else. Okay, problem solved. So she had this theory of action, which is a very document-like table. In the NGO world, this is called a logic model. It's a very common thing that you might see in planning, but to drop it on a slide is really overwhelming. And it takes a lot, especially if you're not familiar with a logic model, to understand what's actually going on here? What are my takeaways, right? So we did a couple things to address the problem solved. We wrote a single sentence description, showed the product, right? Yenko's helps college students track, manage, and optimize financial aid eligibility using predictive analytics. Always show the product if you've got it, right? But then there was a lot we wanted to address in terms of how this shows up in the student journey. And so we brainstormed this, working really hard to take those things from the logic model that are more kind of in theory and say, how do they actually map to how a student would engage with this app throughout their college experience? So we identified 5 milestones that were these high-risk moments in the student journey, right? Beginning of the semester, add deadline, midterms, next semester registration, and end of semester. So we focused on these key moments, and then we mapped, right, the questions that a student might have. Am I taking the right classes? What happens if I drop this class? And then we showed the tools within the app that the student could use to essentially proactively answer that question. So again, more in depth takes someone talking to this, but it really is organized and clean, and I think people can follow the hierarchy really well. Okay, third example. This is Annie Cannon's co-founder Jessica Hubley, and they are also in the nonprofit space. They have a coding boot camp for survivors of human trafficking. So people that are coming out of trafficking, these people, victims that are now rebuilding their life. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of organizations they can get for mental and emotional help and healing. But if they don't have income, if they don't have a way to make money, then there's a high risk of them of recidivism, essentially, of just being trafficked again, right? So they've come up with this idea of let's teach them to be coders and developers, and that's work that they can do from home, they can do from anywhere, and it's something that doesn't require, for a lot of people coming out of this background, they have the idea of being face-to-face in person is really hard for them, and so it gives them that flexibility to make money while they continue to heal and rebuild their life. So her primary audience was high net worth individuals and partner companies. So very similar to when you're, early stage and pitching angels, that's kind of like her. Now this use case primarily was a leave behind. And I want you to keep that in mind as we look at it, because you're going to be like, wow, there's a lot going on here. Yes, that is because it's a leave behind. It's, and a lot of times what would happen is she would have an in-person conversation with a high net worth individual, and then she would send this. So in the conversation, she wouldn't use this at all, but she would send it as a follow-up, which really kind of told her complete story on its own. That's what we were going for with this one. So here's the before. Lots going on, lots of colors. The our method slide is just got a bazillion things it's trying to accomplish all at once. Here's where we landed with it. So even in this view, you can see there's a lot more blocks of copy than, for example, in the Everwash presentation and even the Yenko presentation. There's just more going on here. It feels more like a printed document. And that's what we were aiming for. We did it in presentation software to still give her the flexibility to edit it, right? So if we had done this in InDesign and then delivered it to her, well, she doesn't use InDesign. She can't go in and say, oh, let me just update this number on slide 8. So we did it in presentation software in Keynote because we wanted her to still be able to edit. But we used it almost as like document layout software. So let's look at a couple examples. So here's her before. This was where they were trying to get across exactly what they do. They were trying to do so much with this slide. They were trying to say, here's what we do. Here's kind of the journey of training that our people that participate in the Annie Cannon's program take. And here's how much money they end up making in the end. Way, way too much. So what did we do? Well, you can see on the left-hand side the words building, earning, and training. So we focused on that to do their problem solved, which was training, income, and student-led projects. We kind of rephrased it. And then the top piece, like Annie Cannon's Builds Brighter Futures, was really our promised land statement. Like, what are we going for, right? Training, income opportunities, and a supportive work environment breaks the cycle of exploitation for survivors of human trafficking is really their value proposition. And then there's 3 ways that we do that, right? So using this simple diagram for training, income, and student-led projects just adds structure. Again, there's detail here that would take me longer to read, but I can glance at this and get an idea that they build brighter futures by doing these 3 things. Then we did a second slide that had more of the detail from that R method. This was talking specifically about the training, right? So again, we write kind of a headline on the left: Coding Bootcamp equips survivors with in-demand technical skills using best-in-class curriculum. I can see down there they work with Hack Reactor, Girl Develop It. Okay, I know some of those names. And then on the right, what we did is we talked about the different phases of training that they have: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what they're learning, and the income potential that they have to earn. So if they go through phase 1, just getting digital basics, they can be earning annually $45,000 a year. If they do front-end development, right, their second kind of level of training, now they're up to $80,000 a year, and it goes up from there. So really showing, hey, these people are making money, right? Promised land. Okay, big numbers instead of bullet points. That's exactly what you're seeing here. You could easily see this slide done as 5 bullet points, but doing this layout where you have your big numbers, your big takeaways, and the text, supporting text below it, right? 10 students per class, 90% completion of phase 1, 80% completion of phase 2. Over half are engaged in client work, and 65K is the income for the top student in the pilot class. So really speaks to the benefits, speaks to the performance. And then kind of building on that, right? So that was kind of some of our quantitative data for the promised land. And here we have our qualitative data, right? 3 quotes from people who have graduated from the program and what they're saying. So you get a sense of how you can take some of what you might speak to in a presentation, and in this case, it's a leave behind. It has to live completely on its own. You can still do that in a very organized, structured way. Okay, so let's talk non-designer tools, tips, and tricks, because I know a lot of you are like, I'm not a designer. How do I do this, right? I'm going to give you some tools. For brainstorming, there is an app called Post-it Plus app. It's free, and you can take it and turn Post-its into digital objects. Those 4 yellow Post-its of my little sketches that you saw before, that's how I got them in there. Fonts, here's your best practice. Use no more than 2 fonts. There's almost never a need to use more than 2 types of fonts in your presentation. Colors. Talked about this a little bit before. Stick with 3 and maybe 1 highlight color, unless you're doing a chart where you need maybe a few more. There may be a case for that. Rule of thirds. What is this? This is taking your slide, and you can actually pull from your little rulers. You can pull lines and make a grid on your slide so that you're always working within the rule of thirds. And if you do that, right, this is the same way a photographer thinks about composing their photography, you're going to get a really great slide just by following that one rule. Icons, there's a website called the Noun Project. You can go, they have literally hundreds of thousands of icons. I think it's like a $40 a year membership to be able to download and use them royalty free. Photos, there are some free stock photo sites out there, more than what I've listed here, but Unsplash is one of my favorites. And you can get, again, royalty-free stock photos there. And then there's also, of course, Shutterstock, iStock, that's going to have, you can do membership fees and things like that. And then if you're really going for something great, then you go to the Getty images. Even Reuters has photos that you can do a membership to if you're needing stuff that's more related to current events and things. And depending on who's taken them, sometimes you can get them for a small amount. So a couple of tips there. Okay, but what about pitching on Zoom? You just showed us 3 examples that weren't Zoom examples. Well, there are a lot of things you can look at now of digital demo days that have been done on Zoom. In fact, one of the pitches I shared last week was one of those. What I will say in terms of the 3 examples I shared is that the one that probably fits the Zoom use case best is the Everclean Everwash example of Thomas Kim. Now, why is that? Well, Zoom is kind of more like pitching from the stage, as strange as that sounds, than a leave behind, right? I'm competing. If I have too much text on the slide, I'm going to be competing for attention with my listener, right? We only have one auditory track in our brain, and if I'm trying to read and listen, I will not be able to do that. So I would say less is more, and even less is more when you're on Zoom. Now, can it be just a single picture? Potentially, but then it can't act as your leave behind as well. So think about headlines, simple ideas, and then of course using your appendix for that leave behind. Okay, digging deeper, you want to know more? Here are some things that you might want to check out. Get Backed is a book by Evan Baer and Evan Loomis. In it, there are tons and tons of examples, literally like, I've shared us 3 examples today, but they have examples from venture-backed businesses that have raised money, and you can see their slides. They talk about the storytelling. They've got a lot of great tips in there. They quote Dan Rome, they quote Nancy Duarte. They're pulling from a lot of the same places and specifying it for getting backed. Slide Docs is a free download from Duarte. It's on their site, duarte.com. Again, this is more for a true leave behind experience, kind of the Annie Cannons, but lots to learn from there, lots of tips, lots of tricks. Finally, what do you want to keep in mind for you, for what this first pitch is like, even on Zoom, right? What do you want to leave? What do you want to take? What do you want? How do you want to show up, right? Be comfortable using whatever slides you end up with, whatever visuals you end up with. Be confident using them. And, hearkening back to what we talked about last week, be clear and be compelling. And if you can do those 4 things, you're going to have a fantastic pitch, whether it's in person, even in leave behind, or on Zoom. So thank you guys. I want to transition to Q&A, and Eshem will be kind of facilitating that process.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for the presentation. I definitely learned a lot, especially with the photography related work as it relates to icons. So we're actually going to start with Loretta, who has some questions about the investor pitch. So Loretta, if you could just kindly unmute yourself and turn on your video, please feel free to ask the question.
Hi, Stephanie. Yeah, thank you. That was such a great talk. So I've heard a few talks about pitches, and I've heard suggestions on timing, when mainly being 3 minutes for like the investor pitch. So I guess my question is, like, I want to know, how many versions should I be ready with, or do I just need to be ready at the drop of the hat for kind of any length of session, which I assume is obviously the best case, right? But is there a standard, like an elevator pitch, maybe a 60-second spiel? And then I think I've heard 3 minutes for the in-person or Zoom meetings with investors, up to 10 or 15 minutes, expecting that meeting with the investor to be about an hour long. So I just wanted to get some advice on that. And then the second part of my question would be what you think about putting a password protected pitch slide deck on a website for investors to view.
Okay, good questions. So let's tackle length first. Yes, this is a very controversial one. I feel like there's a lot of opinions. I would say, so right now we're all pitching over Zoom for the most part. So when you're pitching over Zoom, I would say no more than 10 minutes. So it gives you a little bit more time than your traditional elevator pitch, right? Your traditional elevator pitch we talked about last week, I would say is 2 minutes, right?
Okay.
That's something that is like, if someone's just like, hey, so what do you do? What are you working on? What's your company? You can just pull that out right away, right? But when you're on Zoom and when you're coming in the context of, the setup is, this is an investor that, they're interested enough to take a meeting with you, I think you have a little more time. So you can take about 10 minutes in that context and then leave the rest for Q&A. And be prepared, because that's where you may actually reference your slides more than in that 10-minute pitch. You may use maybe 3 or 5 slides in your 10-minute pitch, maybe more, right? Depending on how you approach it, but be ready with the backup and the Q&A to dig deeper. And, then when people always go, well, then how many slides do I have for 10 minutes? I don't do that. I mean, there have been times when I've seen a startup, use like 50 slides in 10 minutes. And you go, oh my gosh, that's a lot of slides, but it didn't feel that way. And why didn't it feel that way? Because they really, were stayed true to that idea of one idea per slide. And so it's not so much about the number of slides and how that relates to the length of time. It's just about how quickly you're getting through that. And often in Zoom, right, we talked about using the screen to your advantage. If you're doing something more dynamically and not staying on the slide as long, it actually can help increase engagement. So yeah, so I'd say 10 minutes, and don't worry about slide number, but test yourself, even maybe record yourself beforehand and go, where did it drag? Where do I just need to have a second visual there because I talked too long? That may be the case, and that may actually increase your engagement. It kind of goes against our natural inclination to simplify, but sometimes more slides can make it simpler than less crammed onto a lot of slides, if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, and then your second question, so we talked about length.
Yeah.
You said, password protected, right?
Yeah.
So I think, honestly, one of the best tools that I've seen for sending something where you can have that ability, but you can also have the ability to basically get analytics on who views your slides is DocSend. And so with that, you actually you can find out what slide do they spend the most time on. Wow, that's actually kind of cool. Like if they spend a long time on one particular slide, that's pretty neat to see. So I think DocSend is.
How do you see that in DocSend? What's that?
DocSend, it's DOCSEND.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's an app that I use to send them my slide deck?
Yeah, you can use it, and you can password protect. You can give them the ability to download or not, but you also get basically analytics on, did they open it? When did they open it? Did they view it? How long did they view each slide? It's pretty cool.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so gonna throw it over next to Jennifer Jackie Johnson for the next question.
Yes, thank you so much. So my question is in regards to Loom. I wanted to know with Loom, how should your deck be formatted for pitching on Loom? And is it the same as pitching from the stage?
Great question. I love Loom. I use it all the time. For those of you who don't know Loom, it's useloom.com. Rhymes with Zoom, Loom with an L. I would say that it is more like pitching from the stage. And I'm happy to send a couple of follow-ups of some videos that I found just in a digital demo day that one of them is a fantastic example. It's kind of the extreme where they used hardly any words on their slides, and you know, recorded it not with Loom but with Zoom, very similar. And it was a great great example of keeping someone's attention and doing that quickly. So for a pre-recorded pitch, right, where it's not a conversation, but maybe you're sending it over, then I think, you know, Loretta, going back to your question, you're aiming for 2 minutes. And you should approach it more like a presentation. If you feel comfortable using animation, use it, but you don't have to. Because with a presentation, you're going for something more cinematic, right? You're going for something, a presentation is more like, you know, watching a movie, and a leave behind is closer to a document, right? It's closer to something I can scan and get the idea. So when you have the advantage of pre-recording it, you have your audio, right? You have your words, your talk track, then I would say approach it more like a presentation.
Okay. Guys, do we have any more questions in the Q&A?
I don't see any more questions, so we can give it a minute, and if not, we can move into our panel.
Couple things I'm seeing in the chat, just from Maria. She said, you know, usually the first meetings with investors are 30 minutes long. Absolutely right. So that's why I think that 10-minute aim is the right aim to go for that first conversation, and then use the rest for Q&A. If you go any longer, you're not going to leave them that time to really them to dig in where they want to.
I guess actually, Stephanie, one quick question before we switch over to the panel. I see Jesus and I see Eugene, but when people are focusing on trying to time their presentations, what's the best way for them to go about doing that? How can you make sure that you stay within that 10 or 15-minute advised time limit? Because we often tend to run over.
Yeah, also another great question. So a lot of times what I will do is I will use Loom for my rehearsal. So I will actually record myself, my screen essentially, pitching, and then I'll go back and I will do self-critique and feedback, and I will see how long I was. And again, what you're looking for is, where are the moments where this drags? Where are the moments where I stay on a visual too long? Those are the kind of things you want to look for, and then improve the next time around.
Okay, thank you. And it actually looks like we have another question from Tasha, and then maybe Tracy. So Tasha, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This was amazing. So my question is, how does the VC pitch slide deck differ from the sales pitch slide deck? And then also, how are they similar? And adding to that, how do you make it that when you're doing your sales pitch that people want to buy? Like, we love you and we love this. That's some of the things I'm thinking about right now. Thank you.
Good question, Tasha. We talked a little bit about the difference between, I think the last week we got into like the B2B, B2B2C, right? Or that kind of thing. And I think similarly, when you're talking about a VC pitch versus a sales pitch, there's usually a core that's very similar. So I would say like your single sentence description and the problem solved are probably really similar. When you get into some of the proof, right? The evidence, the why us, the why now, that's where you're going to see differences. So for a VC audience, the why us and why now is going to be more about how much of the market you can take, what are some of the unit economics, and those kinds of things. For a sales pitch, of course, it's really going to be about what's the benefit to them for becoming your customer. You know, what does that What are the advantages for them? And so you might even use the same case study, but you use it really differently, right? You talk about unit economics when it comes to an investor, and you talk about, customer advantages when it comes to a sales pitch.
Okay, so now we're gonna run over to Tracy Milligan.
Yeah, hi, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. So my question is about a slide that shows your go-to-market plan. This recently came up in a different, I want to say, kind of Zoom meeting I was doing, where they were saying, add that into your deck. And that is something that I've not had added into my deck. And I've been looking for examples for it, but I haven't been able to find any examples for it. When I've Google searched what that would look like in a deck presentation with graphics, in the examples that you've given already today, I've just been able to find 10 and 12 page documents, because they're usually these whole big long drawn out plans, not something that is typically done with just a few bullet points or a few graphics to convey what you want to do. So I was wondering, in any of the decks that you have as examples, do they have a slide that shows their go-to-market?
Great question. I think there's a lot of different ways to come at go-to-market, and so that's probably why you're not finding anything out there. Last week, we talked a little bit about market. And I think this is probably one of the most challenging things to figure out, both, from a business strategy standpoint for startups, but also then how do you talk about it in your pitch? So you've hit on one of the sticky questions, Tracy. Here's what I would recommend. And, I think recommendations probably vary, but what I've seen done really well and be really convincing in a pitch deck is, yes, you need to size out your market a little bit. So similar to the Everwash example, right? Thomas talked about, this is a big market. It's like a $10 billion market, right? And there's no big market share. But more important than even that, I think, is to talk about your path to get to the market. So this is where your launch market strategy comes into play. And I think that's more important for a pitch. And the reason you might see it presented really differently is because there's different ways you can do that. Thomas did that through a case study, right? So he had some funds, some bootstrapped funds to be able to buy this failing car wash and turn it around. That's really his proof that I have a path to get to this market. There's a lot of failing car washes that we can buy, we can turn around, and we can also build from the ground up. So that's his launch market story. You might see that differently. I worked with a company that was working on battery technology, and their launch market was electric scooters. And so they spent a lot of time building out that. Another way you could do this is, there was a company I worked for that was doing software for like companies that match your giving, corporate giving. They had this whole platform that had like a company back end for them to kind of see their stats and data, but also like an employee front end to just see their impact of their giving and what had been matched from their company. And what we did is we sized up the market. We gave some big stats on, like, here's how many companies in the US have corporate giving. And, here's how we increase participation in that, right? When you have this, Wright Funds was the name of the company. But we actually told a couple of, we had some early customer pilots. And so we had quotes and we had some data from each of those customers that was already using Wright Funds. How did that change customer participation? How did that change what was matched? So I think, the market piece is best told, number one, through some big market sizing stats, and number two, telling your launch market story, which is oftentimes a case study or something along that line, right? If you're not at the case study stage, but maybe you have an early stage pilot, right? You have a hunch you can win with this particular group of customers within this space. And so that's what you're going after. You know, that's the kind of stuff you want to speak to. So I can't show you like a perfect slide. I wish I could, but hopefully that helps.